Hey gang, Shane Patrick White here with another edition of Beyond the Process. Today is part 2 of a 2-part series where I'm illustrating a Sunday comic strip. The first part of the series, I inked the strip in Clip Studio. Today I will be coloring it in Photoshop. It's based off a character I created in high school called the Arctic Fox. He's a super spy who's gone into hiding. It was supposed to be for my Patreon, where I would illustrate it twice a month, but as luck would have it, I just don't have that kind of time. So I'm going to use it as a way to demonstrate to you how I color. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the process.
So today we're going to color this comic strip page that I had inked earlier, if you saw the previous episode. But I want to start with something that I don't know if you're familiar with. In animation, there's a thing called color story. And here's an example of a bunch of pages from a previous project. And I blurred them out so you can get a sense of what the color is. It's for a project called Endless Summer. It took place in 1963 in California. And so you can see there's examples of how I try to portray the California sunlight in areas. And then in other pages, when they're grouped together, you can see how the color is very similar. And so as you go through the entire story, the pages have a relationship to each other. Some are more expressive, like with the red, blue, and yellow pages. And some are just a flow state of going from one scene to the next, but you're staying in a relatively calm environment until you get to that last page, which is a little more dark and subdued. So when I have the opportunity, I'll have a script in front of me, and I will go through and I will use a marker. I'll mark up the page to figure out what the essence of the scene is. I'll do that through color. Now with this single page, I went through and I roughed in all the colors, and I got a sense of how I wanted the story to play out, how I wanted it to feel. So in the one panel that's circular, I decided maybe to change that into more of a scope, more of a voyeur kind of color or kind of idea. And that way it gives the sense that this person is being watched who doesn't want to be watched. And so that's a way that the color can actually tell the story above just coloring it as is. And the reason why we want to do that is to help convey an emotion to the reader of how they should feel at any given moment in time. When it comes to coloring, we usually start out with flatting. Flatting is basically just using the lasso tool to select areas that you want colored, and you fill that with a flat color. At some point, once you've flatted the page, then you can start adding shadows, highlights, effects, and things like that. Flatting is something that I used to do on my own, especially with my first graphic novel, North Country. But it took so long for me to do it, it cut into the actual creative time. Most people find that they can do this on their own, meaning that anyone can do this. If somebody knows how to use Photoshop and a lasso tool, they could do it. And that's why if you want to pay somebody, like a flatter, the rate for them can be anywhere between $10 and $20. And what you'll get is a certain amount of detail that is broken up by color shapes. It may not be the colors you are looking for. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but they need to kind of give you the ability to select those areas so you can correct the colors yourself. I use a colorist out of Thailand, I think, and he's like $10 a page. And he breaks up the page well enough for me to go in and start coloring or break it up even further. So you can see now that I'm going through and I'm creating volume. And what I do in my layers is I'll create a flat layer, which is what you had just previously seen. And then I'll go in and do a shadow layer first. I like to work in the shadows because it gives the volume that I'm looking for in the light direction. And then the highlights will be what I add last, which will help enhance the volumes even further. Now, similar to inking, when you're coloring, things have a certain specularity or shine to them. Their surface will either be matte finish, like say clothing, or it'll be very glossy, like chrome or water. And those things are important to differentiate in both line and in color, especially. So it's good to always have reference on hand when coloring, or doing any kind of artwork for that matter, especially if you're not familiar with that stuff. Over time, we see enough of these things and it builds up our mental library. So we can recall, oh yeah, I know what plastic looks like when it's wet or if it's shiny, and I know how to treat that. But if you're not familiar with those things and you haven't built up your mental library, it's good practice to have reference on hand. Another thing that's important about coloring is understanding light sources, and it gives you a chance to spell out what is the focus of each panel versus what is the focus of the entire page. Now you can keep in mind when you're doing these things that if your light source is warm, say like yellowish, incandescent bulb or the sun, more likely than not, the shadow side will be a cooler color, like a blue or a lavender of some sort. But if it's a cool light source, say like the moon or reflective light from neon of some sort, then the shadows will be warm, which could be in some cases the complementary of that color. So if it's an overcast day or if it's rainy and it's twilight, there'll be a blue cast to everything. So the shadow side could actually be more of a burnt umber or a brown or a red. So these are things that I'll explore more in another process video to really spell out how you can create some uncommon color combinations that make sense when you're trying to spell out light. In terms of this page, it's supposed to be a Sunday comic strip kind of thing, which is probably a little more involved than your typical comic strip. It's about a spy who is in hiding, who's about to be reactivated. And so going through and creating a sense of calm with a lot of the colors, which are a little more pastel, indicating that it is morning. He's going to be going out exercising very early in the morning. It's very uncommon for him to see a plane in such a remote area of the... I forget where I actually have him. I think he's like north of Russia. And so I wanted to get a sense of secrecy, but I also didn't want to bathe it in like moonlight or something dark. I wanted it to feel natural. And so the outside stuff feels very calming, but there is this sense of urgency. So when we actually get to the interior of his hideout, it's cooler and more isolated feeling. And that is part of the story that you're trying to convey, is that from scene to scene or panel to panel, is there enough flow that makes sense of like, okay, here's a transition into how this character should be feeling. Here's a transition of how the environment changes, whether it's through weather events or through some other man-made source. So these are the things to keep in mind when you're trying to build out an interesting color palette, as well as color story. And that is always the principal factor in anything we do here, is if it's not befitting to the story, then try again, try something else. And that's the great thing about Photoshop, is you can try a bunch of things. You can go in and use sliders to change color intentions. Now, with this technique, I mainly paint a lot of the shadows and light, but sometimes I'll use the lasso tool and the quick mask to give me a little more, I don't want to say organic, but a little more purposeful shape that I'm trying to attain. So on the wave here, I'm trying to get some whitewater edges on this cascading wave. And that is another coloring technique. Some line work can be colored using a method called, it's like a cut and gradient method. It uses a lasso tool, and you select areas, and then you fill it with a gradient of whatever shadow color. And then you pick a smaller area with the lasso tool, and then you fill it with the next lighter color or whatever, or highlight. I can show you that technique in a later video, but sometimes those techniques can cross over. It just depends on the style you want to go for. The style I work in tends to be, especially for this, tends to be more of the using a hard brush to establish the shadows, and then I'll go back in with a softer brush to hit areas that will turn the volume of whatever shape that is being colored. So around the eye socket of this close-up, you can see that it's a little softer as it gets closer to the light, but like the hoodie has a harder shadow, so there wouldn't be any real softness in there. When you're taking a scene that is primarily in shadow, you have to be careful not to drown out a lot of the detail. So when you're doing your darkest darks, try to keep it from being any darker than 80 to 85%, because you want to allow for the black line to actually do the heavy lifting of creating the shadow. And your highlights, they can be white if you want, but you also have to pay attention to the light source. If it's a warm light source, you might want to have a little more yellow in it, or a little more orange, just to differentiate it. Say you have a flesh tone next to chrome. Now the light source on the face is going to be affected by the color of the highlight. So as for instance, if it's a warm light source on, say, a Caucasian face, then it's going to be even warmer when it lands on it. But if it's a warm light source on chrome, it may not have as much warmth to it. It may tend to feel like more like white. Again, I will cover more of this in a later video, because color theory is a very deep conversation to have, and a lot of people have different approaches to it. And I want to show you a few, and hopefully one of those will make sense to you when you color your own illustrations or comic books. One of the things that I like to do is I like to flirt with some level of realism. Even though the coloring or the strip itself isn't super realistic, I want to make sure I account for things like highlights and shadows. So like on the beach scene here, you'll see some lavender in the sand where the sand is wet and now reflecting some of the sky. And I think it's a pretty cool look. It's subtle, but it grounds the strip in a little bit of realism that says, I'm paying attention, and you should too. It's fun. It's a fun challenge to be able to sort of recreate life, to recreate that essence that this character's world is as real as yours. And now in this case, sometimes I'll create a shadow layer that is set to multiply. And I do that sometimes just to sort of holistically create what would you call it? I want to capture all the shadow work that I've done, because like within shadows there are shadows, which is a little confusing. I know it sounds abstract, but say your clothing will have shadows, but then there's an overall general shadow that covers everything. And that's what I'm trying to represent here with the blue multiply layer. I want to bury the character just enough in realistic shadow to give the sense that he is in hiding. And that's how I tend to do it, in a sort of general way. Just like if I wanted to show sunlight, I would select a larger area and make a layer that was set to hard light. And then using the gradient tool, I would choose whatever color I needed, and I would drag it across the layer. And this would usually be above the black line, because now the black line would be affected by the warm lights, the hard lights setting, and it would feel like it was being infused with that light, that sense of light. In this case, because I did the lettering as well, I ended up coloring the lettering. It's not always the case. Sometimes the letterer will do that himself or herself. And I'm not sure exactly, because I haven't worked with letterers too often, but they may do that pass after the colorist has done their work. That way those colors can work together. But again, I'm not terribly sure if they are responsible for coloring the words or the sound effects. And another thing, sound effects aren't very popular these days, so you don't see them as much as you used to. Now, for instance, in this scope view of the character, the voyeuristic view, it's in a color palette that is very unique. So imagine you're looking through a yellow or an orange lens. And so what I do is I select each of the colors, and then I try to find a darker color that still has a certain amount of saturation to it that feels good to me. And I usually have to pick that out. I mean, the whole panel is mostly warm. And this is where it's going to start getting a little confusing sounding, is that you can come up with cool warms for shadows in a scene where there is also a cool warm for a highlight. Now what I'm doing is I'm trying to keep everything within the palette that's been set by the overlay, the lens, as it were. That way it feels like it lives in that world. I'm not coloring the water green like before. I'm not coloring his hoodie gray. It's all still shape and volume described by highlights and shadows, but under the lens of a amber filter. And it's a fun challenge. Sometimes entire comics are simplified by this approach, by just using warm and cool. Some comics will be colored using orange and blue, or if there's a violent scene, they might switch to red. And again, that is just another way or another approach to coloring, which you could find out by doing the color story in the scripting phase. Now, a lot of people don't have time to do that sort of thing. Color stories they have to be quick and easy. If you get a script and you have time, you could go through, mark it up and say, This is the scene. It's a calm scene. Let's go with greens and blues. This one's a little more violent. Let's ramp that up to like magentas and oranges and reds. Or in terms of intensity, using pastels versus using dark or low values. I think that the term would be called high key, which is like, what do you call it? High key and low key. So high key is like pastels, and low key are like jewel tones or very dark colors. There's a lot of terms that I'm throwing at you, and I'll be repeating them in the months to come. That way you'll get more familiar with the approach and the process in which I am doing these projects. Another approach to coloring that some people do, and it just depends on the line work too, is they will actually color with textures. I try to avoid this for myself because sometimes textures can take away from the actual object. You have to be very delicate with that sort of approach. Some people do it primarily, and some have very good success with it, while others aren't particularly aware. They get sort of lured in by the pretty textures, and it doesn't do them any good. It doesn't do them any favors. So that is something to keep in mind. I'll cover that as well at some point, but for now, this is just a super basic coloring job that I think represents the story well enough. And that's it. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed sharing it with you. And until next time, thanks for watching.